So thanks again, Barbara, for helping run this and setting up all the logistics. Thanks everyone else, judges and attendees, for spending some time on a Thursday evening with us. So I'm here to talk to you tonight about drivers of rural health in both the United States and in Africa. So next slide, please. All right, so disclosures. I don't have any financial disclosures or conflicts of interest to mention before this presentation starts. I do have a personal disclosure that we are still collecting data for this project. So results are incomplete, but I'm really excited that I get to share our current progress on the project and get some feedback from you this evening. So what's the motivation for this project, and what is this project? So the motivation to look a little bit closer into what makes physicians decide to work in rural settings is the fact that there's a massive shortage, both in the United States and in Africa, of rural physicians. Recruiting and then retaining these physicians is a shared challenge. I thought it would be interesting to look at the current trends among medical students, their opinions and their motivations at this point in their training, and then see if there were things that we could discover that pointed to A, findings from other work, and B, some novel findings to help us interpret what makes people choose to work as a rural physician. So I did a fairly comprehensive literature review. I've got a couple papers I'm going to talk to you about, but a lot of the work is focused on a limited number of sites or a limited number of countries. So there have been a number of studies that have looked at specific states. There was a big survey of physicians in Alabama, and they followed them from medical school through residency and then to their positions after residency. Similarly, there's been some studies in Rwanda. There's been a little bit of data collected in South Africa, but really a comprehensive study has not totally been completed, and it's, for reasons that I'll get into, it's been quite challenging. So we'll see how far we get, but that's kind of our goal, is to get some comprehensive information. And then there's some factors that seem obvious, and when I've talked to people anecdotally, they always bring up, oh, you know, I'd love to be a rural doc, but I don't think my spouse would find something that they'd love to do as a rural doc. But I haven't found any evidence that people have looked into that as a factor that's driving people away from practicing in a rural setting. So next slide, please. So the goals are, A, to confirm some previous trends. So there's some pretty good data out there that we'll get into a little bit to show that there are certain things we know drive physicians to practice in a rural setting. We'd like to obtain some data so that we can quantitatively either support or refute some assumptions about these barriers. Is it the fact that people, is the fact that their spouse can't get a job part of this? Is it the fact that they are not familiar with the rural setting, didn't grow up in a rural setting? What are the things that really we assume are true, but maybe we don't have the data to prove that's true? In selecting or in planning a project that collects data from both the US and from Africa, we hope to enable some comparisons and to enable some partnership in troubleshooting the solutions to this shared problem. I think that it really is, these are areas that I've had a chance to talk with people in and to interact with people from. I'm sure that this is a problem that extends to other parts of the world, but I'm interested in comparing these two regions specifically. And one of our specific quantitative goals to make sure that we've got a comprehensive survey is to get at least 20 medical schools from the US represented and at least 20 medical schools from Africa represented. So those are our goals. Next slide, please. So here's just a brief review of some of the most recent or most interesting studies that I was able to find during literature review. So Curran and Rourke, they wrote a paper where they found that medical students exposed to rural practice, so say you've got a rural rotation during your medical school experience, are 1.7 times more likely to engage in practice after they finish their training, so after residency. Combine that with the fact that those who grew up in a rural location are 2 times more likely. So those are some of the key findings. They looked at a number of other things that also help us try and figure out exactly what's driving these things, what's not. McQueen et al., this is a more recent paper published in 2018, I think. They looked at targeted rural training programs, and they saw that, yes, these work, these improve. This was a kind of a literature review. So they looked at a bunch of different programs in the United States exclusively that wanted to establish either rural training tracks or enable students to have additional rural training opportunities during their medical school experience. So they found a pretty broad span, and we'll look at some of their data in just a second of, yes, we're able to increase this from the baseline, but some programs are wildly successful and some are moderately successful. And there does not seem to be a huge, from what they saw, a huge ability to determine what it is in a program that makes it successful. So really drilling down on those either demographic or exposure factors are kind of one of the goals that we want to elucidate further. And then just looking at some of the data from Africa, it's kind of a twofold problem in Africa. First of all, there's a certain percentage of physicians, and this is a pretty consistent number. It used to be far worse, but in recent years, it's been about 30% of medical students in Africa have intentions to practice outside of the country where they've trained for medical school. And then compounding that is the fact that almost all medical students in Africa are attending medical school in an urban environment. They grow up in an urban environment. Those are the areas where they have the resources, they have their connections, their families live. So even worse than the United States, there's a huge preponderance of medical students who become physicians that stay in urban centers. So in addition to the brain drain out of the country, there's a concentration and over-concentration of physicians in urban settings. So next slide, please. So here's that data from McQueen and all that I was talking about. So this is just showing they surveyed different programs. So your y-axis is looking at number of programs that they included in their large comprehensive review, and then the percentages there are down along the bottom. So some of these programs are as successful as achieving 85 to 90% of people who go through these programs end up practicing and staying for at least 3 to 5 years in a rural setting. Some of them are only achieving 20 to 25%. The baseline kind of characteristic for your comparison, about 9% of physicians in the United States end up practicing in a rural setting. So all these programs are doing some good and increasing the odds that the physicians who graduate from their programs will engage in rural practice, but the amount of success that they've achieved is pretty variable. That 9% number, important to compare that to the fact that about 20% of Americans live in an area that would be classified as rural. So certainly underserving those areas, as many of you are well aware. Next slide, please. So what are our methods in this survey? So we have used Google Forms to create a survey to collect both demographic, exposure, and goals data from the students that we're surveying. So the survey is open to medical students at any year in their training, as long as you're in a medical school in the United States or in Africa. I've got some great biostatistic help from one of our great biostatisticians at the U, who will be helping me analyze these data and looking for trends, calculating odds ratios based on their exposure to different factors. And then we'd like to qualitatively interpret these results as well, come up with some comparisons, some of the factors that we can point to and say, hey, wow, look, this is a commonality, or hey, wow, this is really different between the United States and Africa, and some things that are important in one setting are much less important in another setting. So, next slide, please. So we found that it was important to come up with some definitions to make sure everyone was on the same page, especially people from different backgrounds and different continents. So these are some brief definitions just to show you what we included in our survey. Most importantly on this slide is the fact that we kind of openly define the word rural. In the United States, there are some census definitions of rural, but in talking as a group, the advisors and mentors who have been helping me with this, we wanted to make sure that this was inclusive and incorporative of various experiences. And we wanted to allow people to self-identify as, oh yes, I think I grew up in a rural area, because as some of the early comments that I've gotten from people who have responded to my survey in Africa, rural in the United States and rural in Africa mean very different things. So that's kind of one thing we wanted to make sure of. Next slide, please. And then this is just an example of some of our specific survey questions. So on the left-hand side of the PowerPoint slide is kind of an example of some of the demographics, and by no means a complete list of the demographics that we're collecting, making sure that we're asking things about family members, area that the student has grown up in, and then whether or not they've completed rural experiences during their medical school curriculum. And then we want to kind of get some prognostic data from the medical students and say, where on a scale of 1 to 10 how likely is it that you'll practice in a rural area? We're also collecting specialty data. I think that that's another important piece of information. You'll find that, in the United States, of course, the preponderance of rural physicians are family doctors. In Africa, family medicine is kind of a new thing, and there are some developing family medicine residencies, which is really exciting, and I think could be a really good target for this work in making sure that the family medicines that are springing up in Africa encourage students who maybe grew up in a city in Africa to spend some time in a rural area and see if that's something they could become passionate about. And then seeing, of course, how likely it is that they'll practice rural medicine. So those are kind of the goals with some of our survey questions. This is not the complete survey, but we did, in an effort to encourage completion, try to keep the survey less than 5 to 6 minutes completion time. So next slide, please. So again, I don't have thorough, complete results for you today. I found out that especially a lot of the medical schools in Africa require independent IRB approval. So I've gone through IRB process at the University of Utah, and we finished that exemption. And now there's a number of additional IRB approvals that I've got on my list to complete. The good news is I've got a number of contacts from a listserv. I've got a contact who's actually one of the program directors at a family medicine residency in Zambia, which is fantastic. And I think that we'll be able to get good data. It's just a matter of time. Currently, I've gotten some responses from a medical school in Cameroon, which is interesting. And I'll share some of those qualitative responses with you. But that's where we're at for the time being.
Winston, you just got about 1 minute to wrap it up, just to let you know.
Okay. Perfect. Next slide, please. So limitations in this study, of course, this is a voluntary study, so that may encourage some selection bias from people who see the word rural and are interested in that. Next slide, please. And there's a suggestion, of course, for some future work. So I've got, at the beginning of the survey, we consent the participants to follow up with them with additional studies, so we may be able to see what their actual practice locations are in addition to their intended practice areas. And then we've got chances for students to come back and follow up with them if they've not completed rural rotations and see if those rotations change their perception or their intention. Additionally, we're hopeful that we can shape some training practices as well. Next slide, please. I'd like to make just some quick acknowledgements. Dr. Erin McAdams has been my faculty advisor. She's one of our faculty here at the University of Utah in the Family Medicine Department. And Faris Kadon, he's one of our biostatisticians here. He's been instrumental in making sure that we come up with appropriate survey questions. So next slide, please. This is just a brief list of references and final slide. And this is some feedback. I'll leave that up for you guys to read. I appreciate your time. I'm happy to take questions and comments from the audience.
Thank you so much, Winston. I just have 2 quick questions, if you could just give a brief answer on both of these. From Dr. McGill, why did you choose to focus on medical schools and why compare Africa versus US?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that medical schools is kind of a time where we have a lot of, I think that there's a large amount of intervention that can happen there. And I think that during residency, perhaps that's possible, but I think that as far as the US versus Africa, probably because I had a chance during my 4th year of medical school to spend 6 weeks in Zambia, which I thought was really great. It was interesting to see training differences. And then I got hooked up with people who are working on developing family medicine in Africa. So I got really interested in the idea. I happen to have some context. So part of it's serendipity, but I'm really excited by the fact that we can establish some of these comparisons. Medical school specifically, I think in the admissions process and then in the training process, we have a lot of ability to influence students, in that time. So I think a lot of times when people get to residency, they have an idea of what they'd like to do. And I think that there's a little bit more pluripotency in students when they're in medical school as compared to residency. So I think that if the goal is to shape programs and come up with an intervention eventually, that medical school is kind of the time that's ripe. So.
Great, thank you. And then one last question from Dr. Jensen. Is the presence of an incentive program such as the National Health Service Corps a variable among countries to investigate?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think that's a fantastic option or a fantastic item to look into. I think that could certainly be a confounder. I think that also into that is the fact that a lot of medical schools in Africa are, either considerably more affordable or tuition free compared to medical schools in the United States. So I think you hear a lot from, residents who are going in, have already made agreements during medical school or residency to practice in rural settings for sure. And I think that is perhaps a driver in the United States. So I think that that is certainly something we should look into, and something that I had not specifically thought of before this time. So I appreciate that feedback.
All right. Thank you so